The wind howled across the dry plain, brushing through the broken fences and graveside flowers that had long since withered in the sun. He sat alone on the porch, boots dusty, heart heavier than the wooden chair beneath him. A widower not by choice, but by the cruel hand of fate. He hadn't spoken to anyone in days. His house echoed with silence, and his pantry echoed just as loud. Only one crust of bread remained. Yet it was that same night, with hunger clawing at his ribs and grief still raw in his bones, that a knock came at the door. And with it, a pair of eyes so hollow they seemed to swallow the moonlight. She was no older than 10, skin pale, hands trembling, too tired to beg, too proud to cry. No one knew where she came from, only that she hadn't eaten in days, and her shadow looked thinner than a rifle barrel. The old man looked at her, then at the last piece of bread. He didn't speak. He didn't ask questions. He simply broke the bread in two and gave her the bigger half. In a world where kindness had dried up like the rivers, that gesture wasn't just rare. It was almost dangerous. But in his heart, something cracked open for the first time in months. The townspeople later said he'd lost his mind. What's an old man doing feeding strangers when he can't even feed himself? They whispered. But what they didn't see was what that little girl left behind. A thank you drawn in the dirt with her finger, a heart and a name. And as she disappeared into the horizon with crumbs on her lips and hope in her chest, the widower stood at his door a little taller, as if something within him had been fed too. Not his stomach, but his soul. Days passed, then weeks. The bread ran out, but the memory didn't. He began leaving a cup of water by the porch every night. Not because he expected her return, but because that moment, so brief and so unspoken, had reminded him that even in a life full of loss, he still had something to give. He no longer waited for death with folded hands. He worked, even if the work was slow. He repaired a fence. He fixed a shutter. And for the first time since burying his wife, he prayed not for an ending, but for one more day. A year later, on the anniversary of that night, she returned. Not as the starving girl he once saved, but as a young soul with strength in her shoulders and joy in her eyes. She brought with her a loaf of fresh bread, wrapped in cloth. And when he opened the door, heart thundering like hooves in his chest, she didn't say thank you. She ran into his arms and whispered, "I've been looking for my father, and I found him." From that day forward, the house was no longer silent. Because sometimes, family is not made by blood, but by the bread we choose to give when we have none left. The widower's name was Emmett. Folks in town used to call him Mr. Hall, back when his wife was alive and laughter still lived inside his home. But ever since the fever took her, he'd become a ghost that walked in boots, seen but never spoken to. He worked just enough to survive, tended a small patch of land, and avoided the saloon where men gossiped more than they drank. His days were silent, his nights longer than the road to the mountains. Until that knock on the door changed everything. He never forgot the girl's face. Hollow cheeks, tangled hair, and those eyes, like two pieces of winter staring into his soul. She never gave her name, and she didn't stay long. But something about her stuck to him like smoke from a fire. The next morning, he found himself scanning the horizon instead of his empty cupboard. It was strange how one act of kindness, one decision to feed a stranger, had somehow filled a deeper hunger within him. It wasn't just about the bread. It was about feeling needed again. As the days turned into weeks, Emmett began leaving small things by the porch. A blanket, a sliver of soap, a second cup. He didn't say it out loud, but he hoped she might pass through again. Not because he needed thanks, but because her presence had thawed something inside him that had been frozen since the funeral. He started tending his garden again, even if the soil was stubborn. Fixed the creaky front gate, brushed the dust from his wife's old Bible. Not because he believed she'd return, but because something inside whispered, prepare like she might. In town, people noticed the change. He walked straighter, spoke a little more, even nodded when tipped a hat. Some whispered that he'd gone soft. Others said he'd finally started healing. But Emmett didn't care for their opinions. He wasn't trying to be anything to anyone, except maybe a better version of the man he'd become. And deep down, a seed of something sacred had taken root. The belief that life still had more to give, and more importantly, that he still had more to give too. Then one evening, Just as the sky turned that deep purple that only the western plains know, he found something on his porch. Not the girl, but a small drawing, etched into the dirt beside the water cup. A heart. And a name. Clara. His heart skipped like a colt in spring. She was alive. She remembered. And in that moment, he realized the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. After that night, Emmett's routine transformed from survival into quiet anticipation. Every day began with a task, no matter how small. He cleaned the barn that hadn't held livestock in years, repaired the rocking chair his wife once favored during sunsets, even started baking again, though his biscuits came out lopsided and hard as river stones. Still, he kept at it, as if the very act of trying brought breath into the old boards of the house. It no longer felt like a place to wait for death. It felt like a place worth coming back to. One morning, while picking weeds from the garden bed, he noticed fresh footprints near the well, smaller than his boots, but too large for a child. They were cautious steps, not straight, as if someone had crept by unsure whether to knock again. Emmett didn't follow them. He simply smiled and poured an extra ladle of water into the second cup. He knew what it meant. Clara had returned, even if just to watch. Maybe she still didn't feel safe. Maybe she didn't know if she was welcome. But he would wait. He'd waited for a lot of things in life. This was the first time it felt worth it. Then came the night of the rainstorm. Thunder cracked over the hills, and the wind tore through the shutters like a wild animal. Emmett was lighting a lamp when he heard it. A soft cry, not of fear, but of someone who'd been running too long. He opened the door, and there she was, soaked to the bone, shivering in bare feet. No words passed between them. He simply reached for the same old blanket he'd left out every night and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her body collapsed into his, and though he wasn't strong, he held her like he'd never let go. In the days that followed, she said little. Her voice was hoarse, cautious. She told him her name again, Clara, just Clara. She didn't say where she'd come from or what she'd endured, but Emmett didn't ask. Instead, he taught her how to plant carrots, how to boil water with coffee grounds, how to brush a horse even when you're scared of its eyes. She listened, learned, and sometimes, at night, she'd sit near the fire and trace her name in the ash, as if reminding herself she existed. The house was no longer quiet. Not loud either, but alive. The kind of stillness that hums with purpose. Emmett found himself smiling at things again. A loaf that rose just right, a bird that landed near the window, the way Clara always leaned her head on her hand when reading. She was no longer a visitor. She was part of the home. And though the papers didn't say it, and the law hadn't been involved, something had already been made official. He wasn't just a widower anymore. He was something new, something he hadn't dared hope to be again. A father. Spring arrived like a promise fulfilled. Wildflowers dotted the edges of Emmett's land, and Clara began to laugh. A soft, airy thing that startled the old man the first time he heard it. It wasn't loud, but it was pure, the kind of sound that reminded him of Sundays from a life long gone. She took to chores with eagerness, not out of obligation, but because she understood the value in creating something from nothing. They worked together in harmony, as if time had known this moment would come and had simply waited for them to find each other. Clara didn't call him father at first. For weeks, it was just Mr. Emmett, or sometimes simply Sir. But he never pushed for more. He offered stability, not titles. And slowly, she started testing boundaries, not in defiance, but in hope. She'd bring him drawings, asked to braid his late wife's shawl into her hair, sit beside him longer after supper. These were gestures that said, I want to belong. And Emmett answered with consistency, with patience, with the kind of quiet presence that made her feel safe enough to trust again. Then one afternoon, as they mended a fence together, a splinter lodged into Clara's hand. She winced and held it out to Emmett, who gently removed it without a word. She stared at him for a long moment, eyes glistening, and whispered, My real father never looked at me like that. He paused, unsure if words would ruin the moment. Then she added, with a trembling voice, But if you'd let me, I'd like to call you Papa. The fence wasn't the only thing mended that day. So was something deeper, stitched with quiet tears and the grip of two hands that had spent too long alone. Their bond grew stronger with each sunrise. He taught her to ride a horse. She taught him how to dance again, badly, with 2 left feet and laughter that echoed across the valley. She found his wife's old music box and wound it gently every evening before bed. He told her stories about the woman he'd lost and how love doesn't always leave when a body does. They were not replacing what they had lost. They were building something new from the broken pieces, and in doing so, giving each other the thing both had nearly forgotten how to receive: hope. But no story worth telling lives without shadows. One morning, a rider arrived at the edge of the property. Dusty, stern, carrying questions and a name: Clara's. He claimed to be kin, said there had been search notices, and that the girl might not be his to keep. Emmett's heart clenched with a fear he hadn't known since the day he buried his wife. Clara stood behind him, clutching his sleeve, silent but fierce. The past was calling, and neither of them knew yet whether it had come to reclaim or to release. The rider's name was Josiah, a distant uncle from Clara's mother's side, and he didn't come with threats, only facts. "She's blood," he said, dismounting slowly, "and the county might not like her living out here without papers." Emmett didn't argue. He didn't raise his voice. He simply invited the man in for coffee, and Clara, though stiff with worry, sat at the table beside him. The tension in the room was heavy, like a storm waiting to break. But Emmett had weathered worse. And now, he had something to fight for. As the three sat in silence, Josiah's eyes moved over the house. Clean floors, warm stew, a girl who didn't look broken, but whole. "She's different," he muttered. "Didn't expect that." Clara looked up. "Because I was starving the last time you saw me?" she asked, voice steady. Josiah sighed, and for the first time, softened. "No, because you look loved." It was a simple statement, but one that hung in the air like a revelation. The man who had come to take her away now faced something he hadn't expected: a home that didn't need legal stamps to be real. They spent the day walking the property. Clara showed Josiah her garden bed. Emmett showed him the rebuilt barn. And slowly, something shifted. Josiah wasn't there to steal her back. He was there to be sure she hadn't been lost. And what he found was more than he'd hoped for. That evening, as the stars climbed over the hills, he handed Emmett a folded paper and said, "I'll sign whatever needs signing. I just had to see it with my own eyes." Then he turned to Clara and added, "You found your place, girl. Don't ever let go." After Josiah rode off, Emmett and Clara sat by the fire. No words, just shared breath and the comfort of knowing they'd been tested and chosen. Not forced, not claimed, chosen. That night, Clara placed her old ragged shoes by the hearth and whispered, "I won't need these anymore." She had stopped running. The house, once filled with silence, now held footsteps that didn't echo with loss, but with presence, with belonging. And so the days continued, not perfect, not without hardship, but with something deeper anchoring them both. Love that wasn't loud, but real. Family not by blood, but by decision. And every evening, as the sun dipped behind the distant ridges, Emmett would place a piece of fresh bread on the porch rail, not because he expected another lost soul, but to remember the night that changed everything. Because when all seemed empty, it had started with a knock, and a girl who just needed someone to say yes. Summer brought heat and work, but also laughter, honest, unguarded laughter that rose from the fields and rolled across the land like thunder before rain. Clara had found a rhythm. She milked goats, gathered eggs, helped trade vegetables in town, and memorized every line of Emmett's weather-worn face. The townspeople noticed too. She wasn't the same hollow-eyed girl who once wandered into their streets like a ghost. She walked upright now, smiled with her whole face. And when she said, "My father," no one questioned it anymore. One Sunday afternoon, the pastor stopped by with a small parcel and a bigger question. "Would you two like to come to service?" Emmett hesitated. He hadn't stepped inside that church since the funeral. But Clara's eyes lit up. "Do they sing?" she asked, and when the pastor nodded, she turned to Emmett with a look that gave him no chance to say no. The next morning, they dressed in their best. The dress Clara had sewn herself, and Emmett in the coat he hadn't worn in 10 winters. They walked into town side by side, and the whispers that once followed them were gone. All that remained was respect. The church was quiet when they entered, but as the hymns began, Clara's voice lifted like it had always belonged there. Even the pastor paused. "Emmett," sitting in the same pew where he'd once said goodbye to his wife, now held his daughter's hand. He didn't cry, not then. But when she leaned her head against his shoulder during the closing prayer, something in his chest gave way. Not in pain, in peace. Because this wasn't a second chance. It was the right one, finally come home. As weeks passed, the ranch became more than just a place to live. It became a haven. Travelers stopped for water and left with a story. Clara began keeping a journal, drawing sketches of the people they met, pressing wildflowers between the pages. Emmett told her stories of his youth, of rivers crossed and horses tamed, but always ended by saying, "You're the bravest thing I've ever seen." And every time he said it, Clara looked down and smiled, as if still trying to believe it. Then one evening, a stranger came limping up the hill, thin, ragged, eyes sunken from the road. Emmett stepped onto the porch, Clara behind him. The man didn't speak, just looked at the bread on the rail, the warm light in the window, and whispered, "I haven't eaten in 3 days." Without hesitation, Emmett broke the loaf in half and handed it over. Clara stepped forward and gave him water. The stranger wept as he ate, and in that moment, the circle closed. What had been given in desperation had now become abundance, enough to give again. That night, as the stars lit the sky like lanterns of memory, Clara sat beside the fire and asked softly, "Do you think Mama would have liked me?" Emmett didn't answer right away. He stared into the flames, as if searching for her face in the flickers. Then he smiled, slow and sure, and said, "She would have loved you the moment you stepped through that door, even before you ever said a word." Clara nodded, her lips trembling. "I think I heard her once. In a dream. She told me to stay." They didn't say much more that night, but both slept with peace in their hearts. The next morning, Clara asked Emmett to teach her how to shoot. "Not because I want to hurt," she said, "but because I want to protect." He agreed. She wasn't the same fragile girl anymore. She had grown roots, deep ones, and if the world came to test them again, she would stand firm. Emmett taught her not just how to aim, but when not to. The strongest hand, he told her, is the one that knows when to open instead of clench. It became one of many lessons she would later write in a notebook titled Things My Papa Taught Me. That fall, word spread of a nearby orphanage closing down due to lack of funds. Clara's face changed when she heard it. Quiet sorrow clouded her features. After a moment, she said, "What if we made room?" Emmett, caught off guard, looked at the house, then at the girl beside him. "You think we could handle more?" She didn't hesitate. "We already have love. That's more than most places." And so, slowly, they began preparing, fixing up the spare room, gathering extra blankets, making space not just in the house, but in their hearts. When the first child arrived, a boy no older than 6, wild-eyed and silent, Clara met him at the gate with the same blanket once wrapped around her shoulders. Emmett handed him a piece of bread and said, "You don't have to speak yet. Just stay." It was the same welcome he had given without words so long ago. And just like that, the cycle began again. Their home became more than a resting place. It became a sanctuary, a place where brokenness wasn't feared, but mended slowly, with patience, warmth, and bread. Years later, folks in town would say that the Hall Ranch wasn't just a patch of land. It was a place where the lonely became family, where stories were rewritten by kindness, and where one man's grief was transformed into generations of love. And it all started with a crust of bread given to a starving girl, on a night when hope seemed like a distant star. But sometimes, the smallest act becomes the foundation for something eternal. Time, as it does in the West, passed like wind over tall grass, quiet, constant, and full of change. Clara was no longer a child, and Emmett was no longer the lonely man he used to be. The house echoed now not with silence, but with voices, young ones, full of questions, laughter, and the occasional tantrum. Each child that came brought their own weight, their own wounds, but found healing in the rhythm of life on the ranch. Chores, meals, stories at dusk, and the smell of fresh bread always cooling on the windowsill. Clara had become the heart of the home. She taught the children how to read, how to plant beans straight, how to listen to the horses, and how to breathe through fear. Her gentleness wasn't weakness. It was forged from surviving, from rising, from choosing love even when the world had offered none. And Emmett, well, He became the root that held it all steady. The children called him Papa, just as Clara had, without hesitation. It was no longer a name. It was a truth, a role he wore like his old hat, weathered, strong, and familiar. One day, a government agent came to inspect the ranch, clipboard in hand, pen sharp like judgment. Emmett welcomed him in. Clara served tea. The children behaved, not from fear, but from the quiet pride they took in their home. The agent asked questions, checked records, looked over the books. Then, after an hour of silence, he simply closed the folder and said, "I've never seen anything quite like this. You didn't just give them shelter. You gave them a name, a future, and a family." Then he added, almost in awe, "You did what we couldn't." After he left, Emmett sat on the porch alone, letting the weight of those words settle. He didn't do it for recognition, but it mattered that someone had seen it, that someone understood the miracle born from a single act of mercy. That night, he took out his old saddlebag and found the drawing Clara had left on his porch all those years ago, the heart and her name. He framed it and hung it by the front door, where every child who entered could see it. It was more than a memory. It was a reminder of where love had first taken root. The seasons turned again. Some children stayed, some grew and moved on, but they never left the story. Every one of them carried a piece of the ranch with them, taught by a man who had once thought life was over, and a girl who had once believed she didn't matter. Together, they had proven that a home isn't made from timber and nails, but from bread shared in silence, names spoken in kindness, and doors that never close. As Emmett grew older, the rhythm of life on the ranch slowed, but never stopped. His hands weren't as steady, and his back no longer allowed for fence mending, but his mind was sharp, and his eyes still held the warmth of a campfire on a cold night. Clara insisted he rest more. The children took over the harder tasks, always under her guidance. But Emmett remained the center. Each question, decision, and celebration eventually found its way back to his chair on the porch, where wisdom replaced effort, and presence became his greatest gift. One autumn morning, Emmett rose before the sun and walked the property alone, just as he had done in the days before Clara arrived. He visited the well, the garden, the old barn. Everything was still there, but transformed, lived in, loved. He stopped at the spot where he had first handed her that piece of bread, now marked by a flowering tree Clara had planted years ago. Its branches stretched toward the sky, as if reaching for something holy. Beneath it, a wooden bench held a simple inscription, "Begin with kindness." Later that afternoon, Clara found Emmett asleep under that very tree, his hat tilted over his eyes, the sound of laughter echoing from the house behind them. She didn't wake him. She simply sat beside him, holding his hand. He stirred, opened one eye, and smiled. "You've made something beautiful here," he murmured. "We did," she corrected, her voice thick with emotion. "You started it." He chuckled softly. "No, you started it. I just answered the door." That winter, as the first snow fell soft over the roof, Emmett's health began to fade. He didn't complain. He didn't fear it. He'd lived a second lifetime, one full of meaning, connection, and legacy. The children often gathered around his chair, asking for stories, and he gave them freely. Not tales of gunfights or glory, but of mornings spent planting hope, and nights spent holding on when the world seemed too dark. And always, he ended the stories the same way. Never be afraid to give the last piece of bread. You never know what kind of life it'll return to you. And when Emmett's time finally came, the entire valley paused, not with sorrow alone, but with gratitude. A rider went into town to deliver the news. Another brought candles to the house. And the next morning, without a word spoken, every child who had ever lived under his roof returned, some with children of their own. They came not to mourn a loss, but to honor a man who had, through one quiet act of love, rewritten the story of dozens. And it all began with a knock, a stranger, and a piece of bread that was never meant to be remembered, but was never forgotten. Spring returned to the valley, but the world felt different without Emmett's slow footsteps on the porch or his soft humming in the barn. Yet the ranch did not fall into silence. Clara, now a woman grown and strong, carried his memory not as a burden, but as a rhythm, woven into every corner of the land he loved. She kept the bench beneath the tree clean. She continued to bake bread every morning. and she kept the door unlocked at night, just as Emmett always had, in case someone lost still needed to find their way home. In his absence, Clara stepped fully into the role he had shaped for her all along. The children looked to her now, not only for instruction, but for comfort. She walked with the same steadiness he once did, offered the same patience, and repeated his sayings like scripture passed down through generations. Kindness first, always. Bread before judgment. Doors are for opening, not closing. The children listened, and the seeds he had planted through love began to bloom in their hands. One boy, no older than 12, asked her one evening, "Was he really your papa?" Clara paused for a long moment, then knelt beside him and said, "He didn't give me life, but he gave me something better, a reason to live it." That answer traveled through the house like a warm breeze, finding the ears of children too young to remember Emmett and too new to understand what he had built. But now, through Clara, they began to feel it, the depth of belonging, the sacredness of being seen, the quiet courage of choosing love. The local towns soon began calling the place not just a ranch, but Hall Haven. What began as whispers became a name etched into letters, then into records, and eventually into hearts. People sent donations unsolicited. Widows offered quilts. Blacksmiths mended tools for free. Because everyone had been touched in some way by the man who had chosen mercy over isolation, and by the girl who had grown into his mirror. Emmett Hall had never asked to be remembered, but he had lived in a way that made forgetting impossible. And each year, on the day Clara first knocked at that door, the household would gather at dusk beneath the flowering tree. They'd place a loaf of bread on the porch rail. Say nothing. Just sit in silence and remember. The children were taught the story, not as legend, but as truth. That love isn't always loud, and that family is forged not by blood, but by sacrifice, by choice, and by one man who gave his last to someone he'd never met, and in doing so, found everything he thought he had lost. Years passed, and time once again weathered the wood of the house and streaked Clara's hair with silver. But her steps never slowed. She now had children of her own, and they too carried Emmett's legacy like a flame passed from hand to hand. The ranch had grown, not in size, but in reach. The children who once lived there had scattered across the frontier, building families, towns, and communities with hearts molded by love and bread, and a man who had once believed his story had ended. Some became teachers. Others became writers, preachers, even sheriffs. But all of them carried a piece of Hall Haven in their soul. And they told the same story, each in their own way, of the widower who said yes when everyone else had turned away. The story became more than a tale. It became a lesson, a compass, a whisper in the dark that reminded them that the smallest gesture can change the largest life. Clara eventually put the story to paper, not as a novel or a memoir, but as a simple booklet called The Bread on the Rail. It spread far beyond what she expected, through dusty towns, worn saloons, schools, and Sunday pulpits. People read it and wept because it reminded them of someone they loved, or someone they had once been, and sometimes it reminded them of someone they had yet to become. And on the final page, just before the last word, she included a drawing, crude but meaningful. A small porch, a loaf of bread, and two figures sitting side by side, one old, one young. No names, no captions, just an image. Because some stories don't need explaining. They only need remembering. And so, Hall Haven stood, not as a place where a man once lived, but as a place where love had taken root and would never stop growing. And even now, when a stranger knocks on a door in need of warmth, somewhere, on some porch rail, a piece of bread is waiting, just as it was on that night so many years ago, when a widower gave his last and became a father forever. In a world that often glorifies power and overlooks the quiet acts of goodness, Emmett Hall's story stands as a timeless reminder that true strength is found in compassion. He had nothing left to give, no riches, no legacy, no family. And yet, he gave his last piece of bread to a starving girl, not knowing her name, her past, or whether she'd ever return. That moment of uncalculated kindness lit the first spark in a fire that would warm generations. He did not change the world with force, but with the courage to care when no one else would. What followed was not a fairy tale, but a slow, deeply human journey of healing, trust, and restoration. A man who had lost everything found himself again through the simple act of opening his door. A girl who had been forgotten by the world found a home, not through papers or promises, but through presence. And from that bond, formed in silence and sealed by shared bread, a haven was born. A place where lost souls were not judged, but welcomed. Where pain was not hidden, but gently tended to until it softened. This story is not about the past. It's a mirror held up to our present. How many doors have gone unopened because someone thought they had too little to offer? How many hearts have hardened because no one reached out first? Emmett didn't wait for the world to be kind to him. He chose to be kind to the world. And in doing so, he didn't just find purpose. He gave it shape, breath, and roots that continue to grow long after he's gone. Let his story be the seed planted in your day. Remember that what you offer, no matter how small, may become the turning point in someone else's life. A gesture, a word, a crust of bread, it doesn't take much to light a spark. And sometimes, when you give what little you have, you receive more than you ever thought possible. Maybe not today, maybe not tomorrow, but always in a way that truly matters. If this story touched your heart, stay close to this channel. Subscribe to walk with us through more tales that remind us who we are and what we're capable of. Leave a like if this journey meant something to you, and share your thoughts in the comments. We read them, we feel them, and they matter. Because just like Emmett, sometimes all it takes to change a life is to listen and leave the door open.